Have you ever given everything to a job, only to be tossed aside like yesterday's trash? That's exactly what happened to me. I was loyal, hardworking, and never asked for more than what I earned. But when my boss decided I was disposable, he made the biggest mistake of his life. Because sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who will rise and bring everything crashing down. This is my story. My name is Ashley Carter. I'm 32 years old, and for almost a decade my life revolved around one place. Briarwood Consulting, a mid-sized firm tucked inside downtown Chicago. I started as a wide-eyed assistant straight out of college, with a second-hand blazer that was 2 sizes too big and a dream to prove myself. Over time I climbed every rung of the ladder, not because I was the smartest in the room, but because I showed up, early, prepared, and ready to fight for the people I worked with. I wasn't the type to complain. I stayed late, answered calls on weekends, even picked up coffee for my boss's kids when his wife was out of town. People used to joke that I was more married to the company than to my own life. And maybe they were right. But here's the thing. When you give your loyalty to someone, you expect at least a sliver of respect back. You expect them to value your effort, your time, your sacrifice. I wish I knew back then that loyalty in corporate America often flows only one way. My boss's name was Richard Holloway. On the surface, Richard was charismatic. He had that kind of smile that could charm a room and that smooth voice people mistook for confidence. But behind closed doors, behind the glass walls of his corner office, Richard was the type of man who thrived on control. He liked to remind you who signed the paychecks, who held the power. And most of us, we played along because speaking up meant risking everything. For years, I tolerated his temper. The way he would raise his voice in meetings, slam his fist when numbers didn't match his expectations, or throw his pen across the room when someone dared to challenge him. But I stayed, because I thought it was worth it. I thought I was building a future. I thought wrong. The day it all came crashing down started like any other. Coffee in hand, laptop humming, a list of deadlines that stretched from morning to night. But by the end of that day, I'd learned the bitter truth about unfair dismissal. I'd learned what it felt like to be discarded, humiliated, betrayed. And more importantly, I'd discover what happens when you push someone too far. Because this isn't just a story about losing a job. It's about finding your voice when the world tries to silence you. It's about justice. It's about revenge. The morning everything started to unravel was deceptively ordinary. I remember sitting at my desk, the smell of burnt coffee drifting from the break room, the faint hum of printers and keyboards filling the air. My desk was tucked in the corner, but I'd made it home over the years. A tiny plant that refused to die, a photo of my niece in her graduation gown, and sticky notes with quotes like, "Keep going, you're closer than you think." I'd been working on a huge project for months, something that could potentially bring in millions for the company. Long nights, weekends lost, even my birthday spent drafting proposals and building presentations. I poured my soul into it, and that morning Richard called me into his office. Now, if you've ever worked under a boss like Richard, you know that a summons to his office wasn't casual. It was a performance. He loved making people sweat. The glass walls made sure everyone could see you walk the green mile into his territory. When I stepped inside, he was already leaning back in his leather chair, fingers steepled under his chin like some kind of corporate king. "Close the door, Ashley," he said. His tone was calm but too calm. I sat across from him, my laptop balanced on my knees, ready to present updates. But instead of asking about numbers or progress, Richard slid a thin folder across the desk. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. I frowned, opening the folder. It was a termination letter. My name typed in bold. My stomach dropped. First, I thought it was a mistake. Some clerical error. "Richard, this has to be wrong. I've been leading the Anderson project. We're 2 weeks from closing the deal." He cut me off with a wave of his hand. "The company is restructuring. We need fresh perspectives, new energy. Unfortunately, that means letting some people go." Fresh perspectives? After 9 years of giving my life to that company? After proving myself time and time again? I stared at him, searching for even a flicker of remorse. But all I saw was a man enjoying his power. "Richard, I've given everything to this place. I've worked nights, weekends, holidays. I trained half the staff you still have. How can you?" He leaned forward, his voice colder now. Ashley, don't make this harder than it has to be. You'll get your severance. Be grateful for that. Grateful. That word burned in my chest. I wanted to scream, to flip his desk, to expose every dirty little secret he thought nobody knew. But instead I sat frozen. Because that's what shock does, it silences you. You know, they say the 5 stages of grief start with denial. And sitting there with that letter in my hand, I couldn't process it. I thought about my rent, my student loans, the healthcare I desperately needed. My mind was racing through all the practicalities while my heart was breaking. I'd been loyal. Too loyal. And this was my reward. As I left his office, I caught the eyes of my coworkers. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others gave me that pitying glance, the kind that makes you feel small, like you've already vanished from existence. But the worst part? Later that day, I overheard Richard in the break room. His voice was low but not low enough. He was laughing with one of the junior partners. She really thought she'd be here forever, he sneered. But business is business. And honestly, she was getting too comfortable. Too comfortable. I bit down so hard on my lip I tasted blood. What he didn't know was that I had evidence. Emails. Documents. Proof of his shady dealings, the kind of things that could ruin a man like him if they ever saw the light of day. For months I'd quietly saved copies, thinking maybe one day they'd protect me. I never imagined I'd actually use them. But sitting at my desk, tears blurring my vision as I packed my things into a cardboard box, a seed of resolve began to grow. Richard thought he could discard me, but he underestimated one thing. When you take everything from a loyal person, they have nothing left to lose. And nothing is more dangerous than that. That evening, I walked out of the building for what was supposed to be the last time. The city lights blurred through my tears, and I felt like I was drowning in humiliation. But as I boarded the train home, clutching that box like it contained the fragments of my life, I whispered to myself, "No, this isn't the end. This is the beginning." And I meant it. I spent the next few days in a haze. My apartment looked like a crime board out of some detective show. Sticky notes, folders, and a laptop glowing deep into the night. I wasn't just unemployed. I was on a mission. See, Richard thought he held all the cards. But what he didn't know was that over the years, I had quietly built a digital trail. Every questionable email. Every shady contract he'd manipulated. Every time he instructed me to adjust numbers in a report to make investors happy. At first, I told myself I kept those files for protection. Insurance. A just in case. But now they were my weapon. And the beautiful thing about corporate men like Richard is that they never imagine the assistant, the loyal worker bee, might someday sting. I started by reaching out to a former coworker, Jenna. She'd quit a year earlier, after Richard had berated her in front of the entire office. She knew his games. When I called, her voice lit up with both surprise and anger. "Finally," she said. "I was waiting for the day someone took him down." Together we began piecing things together. The inflated invoices, the false expense reports, the way Richard funneled company funds into his personal ventures. The more we uncovered, the more I realized. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was criminal. And Richard? He thought he'd fired me. But really he just set me free. I had time. I had proof. And I had nothing left to lose. The first move had to be precise. If I rushed, he could spin it, bury it, make me look like a bitter ex-employee. But if I waited, if I built the right case, I could make sure the fall was permanent. So I spent weeks building a dossier. A thick, undeniable collection of receipts, emails, bank statements, even recordings of conversations I discreetly saved over the years. It was like watching dominoes line up. One push and everything would tumble. But the question was, how? Then, an opportunity fell into my lap. Richard was hosting a high-profile investor dinner. The kind of event where he preened like a peacock, bragging about his accomplishments. I knew because I'd organized those dinners for years. This time, though, I wouldn't be serving wine and checking name cards. This time, I'd be the storm crashing his perfect night. The restaurant was a place I knew well. 5-star white linens, waiters moving like clockwork. I dressed in black, blending in like any other event coordinator. Nobody questioned me. I walked through those halls like I still belonged. Richard stood at the head of the table, charming investors with his polished smile. His wife at his side, laughing on cue. I watched him raise a glass, boasting about the company's record profits. And then it was my turn. I approached calmly, sliding a sleek folder onto the table in front of the investors. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady, loud enough to cut through the chatter. "Before you finalize any more deals tonight, you may want to review these." Richard's face drained of color. The investors flipped through the documents, line after line of evidence, neatly organized. Misuse of funds, fraudulent contracts, proof of embezzlement that could not be denied. "What is this?" one of them demanded. Richard stammered, his voice cracking for the first time in years. This is nonsense. She's a disgruntled ex-employee." But the room was already buzzing. Whispers turned into accusations. Chairs scraped back as people demanded answers. And me? I stood tall for the first time in months. For the first time in years. "This isn't nonsense," I said. "It's the truth. And I suggest you look closely before trusting a man who treats people and your money as disposable." The fallout was instant. Investors pulled their support. The press caught wind within hours. Richard's smiling face appeared on headlines the next morning, not as a visionary CEO but as a fraud. His corner office was emptied. His name was dragged through court documents. His empire collapsed like a house of cards. And me? I didn't hide. I stood at the front, holding my head high, knowing I had finally taken back the power he thought he'd stolen from me. There's a certain satisfaction in watching justice unfold. Not because of revenge alone, but because you realize you weren't crazy. You weren't weak. You weren't disposable. Richard wanted to erase me. Instead, I erased him. And the best part? I didn't just win for myself. I won for everyone he'd crushed along the way. That night, I walked home under the city lights, the air sharp and clean. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of his shadow. I was free. But more than that, I was powerful. Because once you've been broken and you rise again, stronger, louder, unapologetic, there's no force in the world that can silence you. The days following Richard's downfall felt almost surreal. For years, I had walked into Briarwood consulting with my head down, carrying the weight of loyalty like a badge of honor. Now I walked past those same doors as a different person, no longer an employee, but the woman who brought down the man who thought he was untouchable. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed about fraud, embezzlement, and betrayal of investor trust. His face, once plastered across glossy magazines celebrating Chicago's top CEOs, was now splashed across every outlet for all the wrong reasons. I can still remember standing at the corner newsstand, coffee in hand, staring at the bold black letters. Consulting tycoon toppled in fraud scandal. And beneath it, his picture. Not the confident smirk he always wore, but a photo of Richard leaving the courthouse, head down, jaw clenched, hand shielding his face from cameras. It should have been enough just to see him fall. To watch the man who fired me with smug arrogance lose everything. But what surprised me most was the flood of messages I received. Former coworkers. People who had been too afraid to speak. Even clients who had been burned by Richard's lies. "Ashley, thank you. You stood up for all of us. You gave us the courage we never had." And with every message I realized something. My revenge wasn't just personal anymore. It was collective. I won't lie, there were nights when fear crept in. Lawyers called, investigators questioned me, and Richard tried to paint me as a vindictive ex-employee. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, contracts, his own signature betraying him. Truth doesn't need embellishment. It just needs courage to bring it into the light. And once the truth came out, there was no stopping it. I was offered interviews, opportunities, even job offers from companies that admired my integrity. But I didn't jump back into another office cubicle. Instead, I took time for me. I traveled. I spent mornings in coffee shops without dreading the sound of my phone buzzing. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected in the grind of corporate life. I found myself again. For the first time in nearly a decade, I wasn't just living to meet deadlines. I was living for me. If there's one thing my story taught me, it's this: loyalty is powerful, but blind loyalty can be dangerous. I gave everything to a company that saw me as disposable. I thought if I worked harder, stayed later, sacrificed more, I'd be rewarded. But the truth? Some people, some companies will take everything you give and still demand more. So here's the lesson. value yourself first. Your worth isn't defined by how much you suffer for someone else's dream. Because at the end of the day, a paycheck can vanish. A boss can betray you. But your skills, your integrity, your courage, those are yours forever. And sometimes standing up, even if your voice shakes, even if you're terrified, is the most powerful thing you'll ever do. Richard thought firing me would be the end of my story. But really it was just the beginning. So here I am. 9 years of loyalty gone in a single letter. One arrogant decision from a boss who thought he could control everything. But what he didn't understand, what people like him never understand, is that power built on fear and lies never lasts. Richard Holloway thought he ended my career. Instead, he ended his own. When I look back, it almost feels poetic. The same office where I once sat late at night, fixing his mistakes, became the office the authorities stormed through, hauling out files as evidence. The same boardroom where he raised his glass to investors became the stage for his public humiliation. And the same man who told me to be grateful for severance? He ended up grateful for a plea deal to keep him out of prison. Funny how life works, isn't it? But beyond the drama, beyond the revenge, there's something deeper here. I realized I had spent years believing my value was tied to someone else's approval. That if I worked hard enough, stayed loyal enough, sacrificed enough, I'd finally be safe. But safety doesn't come from pleasing people like Richard. It comes from knowing your own worth. If you're listening to this and you've ever been mistreated at work, if you've ever had your loyalty thrown back in your face, hear me when I say this, you are not disposable. Companies come and go. Bosses rise and fall. But your voice, your skills, your courage, those are yours. And they can't take that away from you. Stand up when you need to. Walk away when you must. And never let anyone convince you that your loyalty is a weakness. Because sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is to yourself. Now I want to hear from you. Backhand index pointing right, have you ever faced an unfair dismissal? Backhand index pointing right, have you ever been loyal to someone who didn't deserve it? Backhand index pointing right, what did you do? And what do you wish you had done? Share your story in the comments below. I promise you, this is a community where your voice matters. And if this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful real-life stories, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Because together, we can expose the unfair. We can celebrate the victories. And we can remind each other, we are stronger than the people who try to break us. I'm Ashley. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to stay silent. When I close my eyes and think back to that moment, sitting in Richard's office, staring down at a termination letter with my name on it, I almost don't recognize that version of me anymore. She was scared, confused, humiliated, but she didn't know what I know now. That sometimes life takes everything away, not to punish you but to force you to rise. Richard thought he was ending my story, but in truth he gave me a new beginning. It's been months since the scandal. Richard's name has faded into whispers, the kind people trade over coffee with raised eyebrows. He's no longer the king of the office tower. He's just another cautionary tale of arrogance and greed. And me? I've rebuilt. Not in the way I expected, but in the way I needed. I launched my own small consulting business, not massive, not glamorous, but mine. Clients come to me not just for strategy, but because they know I value honesty. I've built a culture where people are respected, where late nights aren't demanded, and where loyalty is mutual, not one-sided. Every time I sign a new client, every time I mentor a young employee, I remind myself, this is what leadership should look like. Not fear, not control, but respect. If you take only one thing from my story, let it be this. Sparkles never confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice. Sparkles, giving your best at work is admirable, but giving away your dignity, your health, your happiness? That's too high a price. I thought being the first to arrive and the last to leave meant I was valuable. But true value doesn't come from burning yourself out for someone else's benefit. It comes from knowing when to draw the line. So if you're listening right now and you feel invisible, underappreciated, or trapped, please remember me. Remember Ashley, the loyal employee who was thrown aside. And remember that even when they strip you of a job, they cannot strip you of your worth. Now I want to turn this over to you. Backhand index pointing right, have you ever faced a boss who undervalued you? Backhand index pointing right. Have you ever been pushed out of a job unfairly? Backhand index pointing right, or maybe you've witnessed someone else go through it? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And I know so many others will find strength in your words too. Because when we share our experiences, we remind each other that we are not alone. And we give courage to the next person who needs it. If this story spoke to you, if you felt the sting of betrayal or the triumph of justice, do me a favor. Hit like to show your support. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the right story at the right time can change everything. This isn't just a channel. It's a community. And in this community, we don't stay silent. I'm Ashley, and this was my story. Remember, even in your darkest moment, you hold the power to rise. And sometimes rising is the sweetest revenge of all.